Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody logging in from wherever you are. Welcome to the X Files, the HC X Files. My name is Chaplain Justin Zecker, coming to you live from the Pentagon. I just want to do a quick note of intro for our guest speaker today, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Chapa. Before we do that, I know we just did one of these a couple weeks ago, so it seems like we're doing one of these spiritual readiness focused trainings every other week, but really the intent is to do them about once a month. However, Lieutenant Colonel Chapa's time with us is short, and so I wanted this opportunity to get him on here to talk to the Chaplain Corps prior to him moving on to bigger and better things. So I just want to thank Colonel Chapa in advance for taking time out of his schedule in the midst of traveling and PCSing and lots of life change. Thank you for coming and speaking to us today. Just a quick note on Lieutenant Colonel Chapa. He works for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force Strategic Studies Group, which is an organization that I did not know even existed. And still, I came up here to work at the Pentagon. What the Strategic Studies Group is or what I learned they are, is they're really a group of really smart people that take on challenging and sticky problems on behalf of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and they kind of get at those. And Lieutenant Colonel Chapa has taken on one of our challenges, which is moral injury and specifically moral injury prevention to look at it from an ethical lens. I will allow him an opportunity to introduce himself further, but I wanted to introduce himself to everybody. And finally, before we begin, I just want to throw this disclaimer out there that the views and opinions that are expressed by Lieutenant Colonel Chapa are his own and not those of the Air Force Chaplain Corps, even though we do love him and we love his work, but these are his views and not mine and not ours. So just want to throw that out there. Also, we are recording, and just wanted to say that as a disclaimer as well before we go on. So I'm going to pass it over to you, sir. The floor is yours. Over.
All right, thanks, Chaplain Zecker, for having me. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I think this is important stuff. I hope you do too. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I promise I know the jokes about giving a pilot a microphone. You got to be careful. But I do think my background is relevant here. So I grew up in the Air Force flying airplanes. I went right from pilot training to the MQ-1 Predator, which is a remotely piloted aircraft. We had to learn, I think earlier than other major weapon systems, other communities, how to deal with some of this moral injury stuff in our community. And that was based on some high profile cases that went public 10 or 15 years ago. And we learned those lessons. I think other communities have since tried to replicate what we've done with things like the Human Performance Team. Happy to say more about that later on. So this has been important to me as a practitioner, but then as an academic, I study moral philosophy. And I think there's a really pretty tight overlap between some of the questions in moral philosophy and some of the issues in moral psychology that we're going to talk about around moral injury. So I got a master's at Boston College, taught at the Academy for a while, then PhD at Oxford looking at just war theory. And then I've been doing some AI ethics and other things since then. But this moral injury stuff is really near and dear, and I'm happy to be able to share some of the work with you today. I agree with Chaplain Zecker that the views expressed are my own, but I will say we just met with the Chief of Chaplains on this topic on Friday. And he was really excited about what we're trying to do. So I do think there's pretty close alignment between what we're doing in Strategic Studies Group on this issue and with your senior leaders in your community. So I'm going to kind of go big to small here. You could imagine this being part of a broader topic, right? So if the question is, why should we study the just war tradition or just war theory? There's several possible answers, right? The obvious one is that we'll probably do less bad stuff if we're teaching ethics to airmen. So we can mitigate harm to civilians, reduce inappropriate uses of force, et cetera, et cetera. But also we might get some additional operational effectiveness out of it. And I think there is a way to look at the principles of war and the just war principles and see what that alignment looks like. But that's not what I'm talking about today. Today, what I want to talk about is how the just war tradition impacts moral readiness. And I hope the term moral readiness is obvious to you. I don't have a good definition here written down or anything, but my general sense is that when human beings in the profession of arms go to war and have to take the lives of other human beings, that is a significant emotional, psychological, spiritual event. And so in as much as we need to be prepared as sort of technical and tactical experts in my line of work flying airplanes, we also need to be morally prepared. We need to be morally ready to do the hard work that war demands of us. And that's what I want to talk about here. So I'm going to start with why. As Simon Sinek says, this briefing comes about for any number of reasons, but one way to tell the story is that years ago, I was the Air Force's chief responsible AI ethics officer. I was the AI ethics officer for the Department of the Air Force. And an HQE, that's kind of like a senior civilian, is the equivalent of a protocol equivalent of a 1-star, an SES-1, kind of a technical guy from Silicon Valley working in the Pentagon, invited me to lunch in the executive dining room. That's the first and only time I've ever been in the Air Force executive dining room. And we sat down to lunch. I had never met this guy. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. And his opening salvo, his opening comment was, I don't understand why you would be opposed to autonomous weapons in a Taiwan Strait scenario. And I said, hi, I'm Joe Chapa, and I'm not in principle opposed to autonomous weapons in a Taiwan Strait scenario. And he said, oh, I thought you were the ethics guy. Right. So it dawns on me that when people hear ethics, when people hear me talking about ethics education, they might have this idea that the role of the ethics person is to just say no to everything. The ethics person is the guy who says, no, shouldn't do that. No, can't do that. War is bad. Killing is wrong. And I think there's a lot more to it than that. And so that was the first hint I got that we might be, people who teach ethics in the Air Force might be giving the wrong impression to practitioners and people working in the building. Here's reason number two, why number two. This is the crew of Snuffy Smith. Snuffy Smith was a B-24D Liberator in the Mediterranean and North Africa during World War II. This is the crew, 10 folks. This strapping gentleman here at the bottom right is Lieutenant Frank B. Randall. Frank was a bombardier navigator, meaning sometimes he went out on a mission as the bombardier, sometimes he went out as the navigator. And he flew all of his missions and he came home safely. He did crash an airplane once, but that was in training here in the United States. His experience in war was as benign as it can be as part of a strategic bombardment crew in World War II. So they got shot at a lot, but as far as I know, he didn't lose any crew members, and he didn't get wounded himself. Nevertheless, while he was flying those missions, he had gotten married right before the war, as many young men did back then, and so he wrote letters home to his wife Norma. And in those letters, one of the things he said is, "I don't know how God could forgive me, given how many people I've killed." And that is textbook moral injury. Right? We didn't have the language for it back then in 1943, 1944, but who boy, that is moral injury. Frank Randall ended up coming back from war, having 5 kids. The youngest is my mom. And he never talked about this ever again with anybody, as far as I know. Didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about his sort of moral, emotional struggles with it. But the fact that folks in World War II experienced moral injury, despite the fact that we didn't have the words for it, is to me an indication of how we should think about moral injury in great power conflict. I reference World War II because really that's the last time we did great power conflict for real. And it was pretty horrific. I'll come back to that later on in the talk. But I don't know that we're adequately preparing our airmen for the scale of destruction that they can expect in great power conflict. Okay, so that's kind of 2 ways of saying where this talk came from, why I care about these issues. I need to do just a little bit more cleanup. I'm not out here saying that ethics education is the single solution, the sort of silver bullet to solve the moral injury problem. I think of this as a 3-legged stool. Certainly we need the operational psychologists, the mental health professionals, the social workers. That's one important element of it. Spiritual fitness, the folks that you all do on a regular basis, I certainly think is an element of it. But I do think ethics education is a part of it. And I'm going to talk about that here. So just because I'm focused on ethics education, that doesn't mean that's the only thing important. It just means that's what my expertise is in. So that's what I'm going to focus on. All right, I'm sure you're aware of sort of moral injury as a field of study. I do want to put some sort of rigorous academic meat on the bones here. This is based on a dissertation published in 2015, Sheila Frankfurt's dissertation. I like this dissertation because it's a meta study. So she pulls in all these different studies. So rather than focusing on one sort of subject group, this study pulls a whole bunch of subject groups together. So first question is, what percentage of veterans of the post 9/11, call it global war on terrorism, call it counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, whatever you call that 20-year period of fighting in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, et cetera, what percentage of U.S. veterans experienced a transgressive act? Now, she calls it a transgressive act because according to one well-known definition of moral injury can occur when a person witnesses or participates in an action that cuts against their deep views of humanity. So if you have a deeply held view of what it is to be human, and you witness or participate in an action that violates that sense of what it is to be human, you might suffer moral injury. So the act that causes moral injury, Frankfurt calls that a transgressive act. And here's the breakdown. Of the veterans, there are thousands of veterans, most of them Army, just because the Army's the biggest. There are so many of them. But in general, the veterans coming home from post 9/11 wars, 54% experienced a transgressive act. That means 54% experienced some kind of moral injury, and 46% didn't. Now, of those 54% that experienced a moral injury or saw or participated in a transgressive act, how does that break down? What were the causes of those transgressive acts? I'm going to throw some numbers at you. 34% was handling dead bodies. Sorry, that's 39% handling dead bodies. Killing an enemy combatant was 17%. Injuring or killing a non-combatant was 5%. Friendly fire, so causing harm to either U.S. forces or friendly forces, international forces, was 5%. And then other, the 34% is we don't know. Those are going to be different categories that don't really fit into these big four buckets. And there's a reason I'm throwing all these numbers at you, and something that I want to highlight here. So first of all, it is unsurprising that a person can experience moral injury if they're engaged in a military operation that causes harm to civilians. Why? Because causing harm to civilians is bad. It's morally bad. I don't say it's morally wrong, because I think sometimes causing harm to non-combatants as a side effect, even a foreseeable side effect, can be morally justified. In the just war tradition, as well as in international humanitarian law, we call this the principle of proportionality. Under the law, in the DoD Law of War Manual, it says that a military action is proportionate if the concrete and direct military advantage significantly outweighs the cost in loss of civilian life or damage to civilian property. So you might be legally, even morally justified, not you chaplains and religious support teams, but me, the combatant, I might be morally justified in killing combatants as a side effect if the military objective is sufficiently weighty. Now, notice the 5%. Why is that number so small? Well, because we just don't kill that many non-combatants in the post 9/11 wars. Obviously, there were some, all of them were tragic, and I wish that they were all avoidable. Some of them made headlines, but in general, it would be rare for a U.S. service member to be responsible for killing or injuring a non-combatant. That's why that number is so small. So far, there's no mystery here. If you participate in a military strike, in my business, in the Predator business, let's say it's that Hellfire shot where the kid runs into the field of view at the last second and there's nothing the crew could do. That has happened. I would absolutely expect that crew to have to deal with some moral injury as a result. Makes total sense. Here's the mystery. Why should it be the case that killing an enemy combatant can cause moral injury? 17% of those who suffered moral injury did so because they killed a combatant. Killing an enemy combatant is what we set out to do. That's not an accident. That's the mission. That's the job. That's what the profession of arms does during conflict. Now, obviously, we're not trying to kill as many people as possible, and there's lots of nuance where maybe I'm not trying to kill the tank commander, I'm just trying to blow up the tank. But in general, in war, we don't think of killing enemy combatants as morally wrong. Sometimes it's morally advisable. It's the thing that we ought to do in order to bring the war to an end. And yet, military members suffer moral injury because they kill enemy combatants. I want to dig into this mystery a little bit to see if we can figure out why that might be. Now, notice the 17% is much higher here. I don't think that's because you're more likely. Let's suppose you're in a mission that kills one enemy combatant who gave up his right not to be killed and inadvertently kills one non-combatant. I don't think that the odds are higher that you're going to suffer moral injury for killing the combatant. I think the reason that number is bigger is only because we kill a lot more combatants than non-combatants. So the odds that you will have killed a combatant during the global war on terrorism is just higher, given the statistics. So this is the mystery I want to dig into here for a little bit. Why should it be the case that people suffer moral injury even from doing the right thing, which in our business sometimes means killing people who are combatants? I'm gonna give you some weird philosophical cases. But before I do that, I want to sort of offer a defense, a justification of absurd philosophical cases. So I'm going to appeal to the United States Supreme Court. If they can do it, I can do it. This is the claim I'm making here. If it's good enough for the Supreme Court, it's good enough for me. This is a case from years ago, 2014, called Navarrete v. California. Navarrete was driving a F-150 pickup truck in California. He was driving erratically, or so the story goes, and a third party, just somebody else on the street, saw that he was driving erratically, called the police with an anonymous tip and said, hey, there's a blue F-150 license plate, whatever it is, and he's driving erratically. You should check it out. So the police go to stop the vehicle. They stop the vehicle on the grounds of the tip that he was driving erratically. But when they stop the vehicle, they find hundreds of pounds of marijuana in the back of the truck. This was a long time ago. Marijuana used to be illegal in the state of California. So he ends up getting arrested, not for driving erratically, but for having illegal marijuana in the back of the truck. Now, when that happens, he ends up appealing, and his lawyer makes the case all the way up to the Supreme Court that the police should not have pulled him over on the basis of the anonymous tip, because the police should have to validate the truth of the tip before they act on it. So this is the argument. Mr. Paul Clement is his lawyer. He's standing in front of the justices of the Supreme Court, and he says they should not have pulled him over because they should have to validate the truth of the tip before they pull him over. Now, we just heard from Chief Justice John Roberts, who said, hold on, what if in the scenario, this is the absurd philosophical case, what if in the scenario, it's not that he's driving erratically, the tip is that he's throwing bombs out the window of his car every 500 feet, and the police receive this tip. Are you really telling me that the police can't pull the car over to stop the bomb throwing until they wait and see a bomb being thrown out the window to validate the tip? Okay, so that's the John Roberts answer. Here comes Justice Scalia. If you think John Roberts gave an absurd philosophical case, then here's Justice Scalia, who says, hold my beer. And Justice Scalia says, what if the tip is this person has an atomic bomb given him by Al-Qaeda, and he's driving it into the center of Los Angeles to eradicate the entire city, and you let it go? And I think what's happening here is that Justice Scalia is not making jokes to make jokes. He's trying to figure out where is the limit of this principle. How do we figure out how far this principle goes? And I'll let you decide if you think he's right or wrong about that. You can look up the outcome of the case. But I want to set this up as an absurd philosophical example that sometimes can help us sort of get out of the messy real world cases where the facts always are messy in the real world cases. But in these absurd philosophical cases, we can really dive in and try to figure out what the philosophical principle is and how far it goes. So this is the stuff of philosophy. This is what philosophers do. And this is what I'm going to do with you for a few minutes. These are all cases from my dissertation on this topic of how you explain this mystery of why killing a combatant can be the cause of moral injury. Here's case number one. I'm going to call it confiscated vehicle. Imagine you're a police officer. There's someone getting away. They're getting away in a car that just committed a crime. They're about to commit another violent crime, and you need to stop them. It's very important, morally speaking, that you, the police officer, stop them. And you can confiscate a vehicle. You have two choices. One vehicle is being driven by its owner. It's properly licensed, it's properly maintained, it's insured, everything's on the up and up. The other is a stolen vehicle, and it's being driven by the person who stole it. The question is, which vehicle, if you had to choose, which vehicle should the police officer confiscate? Should the police officer confiscate the vehicle that's being driven by its own owner, or should it confiscate the vehicle that's been stolen? Anyone want to pipe up? I invite you to participate if you want. If not, I'm happy to fill in the blanks for you.
Like, we all know to not have speaking because
I respect your silence, but I am telling you, we're going to do three more. So get ready on that mic button if you want to jump in on one of the next three. I think most people are going to agree that if he has to take a car, he should take a car from the person who stole the car. Because if he takes the car from the person who's rightfully driving their own car, two things are going to happen. One is they're not going to be able to drive the car anymore, and that's a harm. But two, he's going to violate their right. He's violating their property right. So it's harm and it's a rights violation. If he takes the car that's been stolen, it's true that that person won't get to drive the car anymore. That's a harm. But that person had no right to drive that car in the first place. So although the police officer is causing a harm, he's not causing a rights violation. And that's what I want to do with these cases, is show how the rights violation and the harm can actually come apart. And sometimes it takes some absurd philosophical cases to be able to understand it. All right, here's case number two. This is called rock rescue. You can see those two rocks are about to fall. One is going to fall on a single person. The other rock is going to fall on two people. But here's the key. Here's the trick. The one that's going to crush the two people is being blown by the wind. It's an accident. It's a freak of nature thing. It's just a natural occurrence like a mudslide or an avalanche. The other rock is a murder. There's a villain up there who is intentionally pushing the rock off the mountain to land on this victim because they want to murder the victim. And now here you come along on the path, you have this magical ray gun that allows you to evaporate one of the rocks, but you only have time to destroy one of the rocks. So which rock are you going to destroy? Are you going to save the two people who are about to die of natural causes? Or are you about to save the one person who's about to be a murder victim? What do you think?
Hey, Lieutenant Colonel Chapa, this is Chaplain Zeger real quick. We're just picking up a little bit of background static from, I think, your cube farm there, just for your heads up. And I don't have an answer to this ethical quandary. I would probably stop the murderer, though, personally. Over.
Sorry, sound like voices in the background?
Yeah, I think we were picking up a little bit of background noise from
There's a lot of noise back there. Everybody, take 60 seconds and think about what you would do about these falling rocks.
Yeah.
All right, let me know if it gets bad again. Okay, I think a lot of people, Chaplain Zucker notwithstanding, are going to choose to say the two people rather than one. Yeah, is that Jason? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you choose to do nothing, are you the guilty one? You're sitting there with the ray gun. That'd be interesting. Over.
That's great. Yeah, there's whole literature on that about the difference between doing and allowing. In fact, I'm sure you're familiar with the trolley problem. That's why a philosopher named Philip Foot came up with the trolley problem in the 1960s. The idea is the trolley problem, the trolley's headed toward 5 people. It's going to run them over and kill them. But you could throw the switch and the trolley will move to another track and only hit one person. And that whole thought experiment, this absurd philosophical case, is designed to get us to think through what is the difference between doing something bad, causing bad things to happen, and just allowing something bad to happen.
So here's my follow-up to that. With the 2 rocks, I mean, personally, I would stop the murder one because it's intentional. You can stop it. The other one, the wind could still blow that thing off the side of the edge and miss the people. But here's a question, chaplains, we witness a lot and don't do anything as well because of the non-combatant status. So we're going to have this inherent moral injury watching someone walk out of our office knowing they're going to go hurt somebody or something else. And so there's a whole interesting dynamic. That's why I brought in the witnessing, but doing nothing about it. It's a different dynamic for us. Over.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great input. And I often use the word you to say, imagine you are in this situation. I recognize that you are non-combatants by design. And so feel free to catch me on that kind of thing. I am very sympathetic to your work. I think your work is very important, but I didn't grow up in the Chaplain Corps. I grew up flying airplanes. And so sometimes I have some blind spots there. Okay, so in this case, I think, again, rights and harms come apart, but there's something interesting happening here. So I think most people are going to say save the 2 people rather than the one because it's two human lives. Human lives are precious. It's a bummer that something bad is going to happen here, but if I can save 2, that's better than saving 1. And if that's the right instinct, maybe it's not, but if that's the right instinct, that's noticeably different from the first case. Because in the first case, it seemed like what mattered was the rights violation. We don't want to violate anybody's rights. Here, someone is about to have their right not to be killed, their right to life violated by an aggressive villain. But we're saying that's not the most important thing. And I think the difference here is exactly like you said, the difference between doing and allowing. The police officer had to cause harm, had to take a car. Here, the person with the ray gun is not causing the harm, they're just preventing a harm. And so the villain is the one responsible. So I think there is that distinction between doing and allowing, I think, is at play. I promise I'm going to get through these next 2 a little bit quicker. Ship captain, imagine that there's 2 villains, they've boarded a ship, and the ship captain is completely innocent. He's not a party to their crimes, but they're about to go do some criming. And it's a violent crime and it's going to hurt lots of people. And you are not chaplains. I am a sniper and I can take out one of these people from far away. Now, the question is, should I shoot the 2 villains and then they'll die, which is bad, but they won't be able to kill all those people they're about to go kill? Or should I just shoot the ship captain and that will leave the ship out there adrift for some period of time until the police can show up and then everyone will be safe? And again, here, I think most people would say even though it's 2 to 1, even though 2 people would die, it's better to cause harm to the people who've given up their right not to be harmed, even though there's 2 of them, than it is to hurt the innocent person. So I hope what you're seeing here is these weird, absurd cases shed some light on when it matters that there's more harm being caused and when it matters that there's a rights violation. This is the last one. Military people hate this one. I might be wrong about this. Now imagine I've got a bad guy on the ship. You can see him there pointing his gun. And there's 10 workers on the ship, 10 crew members on the ship, and there's 10 folks working on the dock. And I have 2 choices. In order to stop this person from killing 100 innocent people, I can either blow up the ship or I could blow up the dock. If I blow up the ship, 10 innocent people die and 1 bad guy. And if I blow up the dock, 10 innocent people die, but not the bad guy. And again, the bad guy will then get arrested and everything will go forward without him being harmed. I think it is my considered view as an ethicist that although this is a tragic case, all things considered, it's better to kill 10 people than 11, even though the 11th person doesn't have a right not to be killed. And all of these absurd cases are trying to drill down and say, is it the case that it might be morally bad to kill an enemy combatant, even though the enemy combatant has given up his or her right not to be killed? I think that's how to solve this mystery of why moral injury can obtain, why a person can suffer moral injury, even though They killed only people who had lost their right not to be killed. I think the reason that this is so compelling, at least to me, is that if you think about human life as being special, and I do, then taking human life on some level has to be bad, even when it's not the worst thing, even when there are other moral concerns, such as war, that say the right thing to do in this case is to take that person's life, even under those conditions. I think it's bad. I think it's morally bad, and I wish we didn't have to live in a world with those conditions. So I want to kind of leave these cases and bring you now to a more general principle. This is Rosalind Hursthouse. So I mentioned Philippa Foot. Philippa Foot was a philosopher at Oxford in the 60s. One of her graduate students, Rosalind Hursthouse, comes along and she says this. I'm not going to read that whole paragraph to you. You can read it if you want. But she's describing what happens when a person faces two options that are both, if they were faced with one of the options by themselves, both options are bad, morally speaking. Nevertheless, she must choose one of the options. And Hursthouse says this remorse or this regret or the new requirement to apologize or whatever this is as a result of having to choose a bad option, this is called the moral remainder or the moral residue. The way I used to talk about this with my students at the Air Force Academy is imagine that you were driving your car and you were not at fault at all. You were sober, you were well rested, the car was well maintained, everything's going fine, but owing to some freak accident, you get in a head-on collision. You live, but the person in the other car dies. Imagine that you see that person's grieving spouse at the grocery store a week, 2 weeks, a month later. From inside you, bubbling up from inside you, there would be words that would be on your lips when you see that person. I think you would, in the depths of your soul, you would be inclined to say, I'm sorry, even though you didn't do anything wrong. You're not culpable. You're not morally to blame for what happened. And yet we have this very strong sense that I owe and I'm sorry. I owe an apology because even though I didn't do anything culpably wrong, I participated. I was somewhat responsible for this tragic outcome. That's what Hursthouse is saying is this moral remainder. And I want to put these two principles together and say, if it's the case that it's morally bad to take human life, even when it's the right thing to do, and if it's the case that when we have to choose between two bad options, there's a moral remainder, I think that can help to explain why combatants can suffer moral injury, even though they did everything right, even though the only people who died were enemy combatants who needed to be killed. Okay, now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about how this pertains to great power conflict. And I want to start by saying, as Taylor Swift might say, hi, it's me, I'm the problem. That's me. That's August of 2025, just less than a year ago. For the last 6 years, 5 years, something like that, every August or July, I go give the ethics and character lecture at the Air Command and Staff College. So that's me. Those are some of your friends there in the audience at Air Command and Staff College. And there's me talking about Captain Dan. And I've been talking about Captain Dan for about 15 years. The Captain Dan case is one where Captain Dan was flying a Predator. The bad guy is on a motorbike. He's a leader of a homemade explosive ring, so he creates IEDs to blow up Americans and civilians. And every day, this guy would go to his homemade explosive factory and he'd put a kid on the back of the motorbike. And he did that because he knew that the Americans would be less likely to shoot him if he used the child as a human shield. I think that's morally pretty detestable behavior. And I've told this case over the last 15 years because it really helps to elucidate the moral principles involved. But unfortunately, because we're talking about one Captain Dan, one bad guy, one kid on the back of the motorbike, cases like this do a terrible job of preparing airmen and guardians for the horrors of great power conflict. And I worry, as an ethics educator in this uniform, I worry that we in the United States Air Force have gotten ourselves stuck into a mode where we teach ethics based on 20 years of global war on terrorism, where the cases are often one bad guy and one civilian and one decision maker. And that's really good for elucidating the moral principles, but really bad at preparing airmen and guardians for the horrors of great power conflict. So that's kind of the hypothesis that I want to drive here. I have a little bit of analysis to offer for why I think this is the case. So these are not numbers here. This is all notional, but I do think it helps to tell the historical account. So imagine back in 1991. 1991 was kind of the last big fight we had, arguably before Epic Fury. And I started all this work before Operation Epic Fury. And I think since we're still in the middle of that conflict, It's not clear yet, right? Or we're so close on the heels of the end of that conflict, perhaps, that it's just not clear yet what the outcomes are. So I'm going to sort of abstract from Epic Fury and talk about the 1991 Gulf War. So I think in 1991 we did have high intensity fighting in the United States Air Force, but I think that high intensity fighting was constrained to a fairly small percentage of airmen. And then our next sort of major conflict, I know there were some operations, Kosovo, things like that, but the next major conflict were the post 9/11 wars. And in the post 9/11 wars, all of us, to some degree or other, participated in conflict. I know not all of us, but the vast majority of line folks in the United States Air Force deployed to theater, participated in some way, at some to some degree to combat operations, right? It used to be the case that if you get a dozen Air Force folks together, the odds that all of them went either to Afghanistan or to Iraq was pretty high. However, generally speaking, those conflicts were low intensity conflicts. There are outliers, right? Battlefield airmen have always been doing intense things. There are always going to be outliers, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the force experienced war, but we experienced war in a low intensity kind of way. And I think in great power conflict, what you can expect is high intensity across the force. Colonel Seligman, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for this. I just wanted to see if you could define the high intensity piece. For example, during the Balkans, aviator, it was, I think that aviators would just fly out from Aviano, they'd go drop some bombs, and they'd come back and they'd be at dinner with their family, unless you were flying from the CONUS. And that was something that was pretty new. That's the stuff you guys dealt with in the Predator environment. Are we talking about aviators who are dropping bombs, or are we talking about like A-10 pilots who are directly strafing targets that they can see? Or are we talking about people that are on the ground in high intensity combat?
Yeah, sir, great question. Thank you. What I'm really focused on is the scale of destruction that we're causing. So I think, the two things that we in the profession of arms are potentially asked to do is killing and dying, right? And I think that both of those are important. Both of those require moral readiness. And so what I'm really focused on here is the killing part of it, the use of force to take human life. And I picked 1991 in part because there were scenarios there, such as the Highway of Death, right, where we brought combat power to bear in a way that killed hundreds or thousands of people at a time. That's the thing that has been rare over the last 30 years. And so all of this is sort of hinting toward what might great power conflict be like in, say, a shooting war with China. And so the intensity I'm referring to here is the scale of destruction that we're causing. That's what motivated my grandfather to say, what he said about God not being able to love him. I will say just initial sort of findings, initial lessons from Operation Epic Fury is that it seems to me that a big part of the cause of the mental health outcomes that we're seeing in Operation Epic Fury is not the killing, but it's the dying, right? So, I was in Afghanistan, we got shot at, but they were small rockets, and the odds that one of them was going to get you were pretty minimal. And because of the ballistic missile and drone threat that Iran poses to the entire CENTCOM AOR, it's a difference in kind. And so now deployed airmen in the CENTCOM AOR feel like they are under physical threat all the time in a way that just wasn't true in the post 9/11 war. So that side of it, the facing risk, the possibility of dying for one's country, that's one element of moral readiness. I'm really focused though on the requirement to take human life. So that's what I mean by intensity. It's a great question. Okay, the other thing, there are some other things happening here, right? I'm going to show you, this is from Our World in Data, which is a great data source. I'm not saying that just because it's from Oxford, but I'm going to show you they have this sort of data visualization tool, and I'm going to stop it when we get to the turn of the century. So what you're going to see is deaths in war per year, and the war can be any kind of war, civil war, interstate conflict, whatever. You notice that we're starting there in 1946. That's because scholars don't agree on the death toll from World War II. So you can imagine if World War II were included here, there would be just mountains of deaths owing to state-based conflicts. So we're going to start in 1946, and you can see what it looks like. I think I stopped it. Yeah. So stopping there at the turn of the century. If all you saw was this slide, you might have the impression that everything's going great, right? Over time, over the last 50 years, second half of the 20th century, we have driven deaths in interstate conflict down. That's probably because of more precise weapons, perhaps because more disciplined forces, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you continue this story into the 21st century, you really get a different story. So you see the spike there. The brownish color is in the Middle East. So a lot of that brownish color is going to be U.S. operations, Allied operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also sort of civil war and turmoil in Syria. But then the purple lines that come later in the chart, that's in Africa. So that's really not U.S.-based counterterrorism conflicts. Those are civil wars in Africa. And so that death toll is on the rise. And so that makes me nervous, right? I think we could lull ourselves into a false sense of security that says, hey, wars continue to get, I mean, if you will, less and less lethal in the sense that fewer and fewer people die in war. I don't think that trend is consistent anymore. And that should at least give us pause to think about what the next conflict might be like. Okay, so if we think about this sort of life cycle of moral injury, right? Imagine, I know that people can suffer moral injury for all kinds of things, including things that happen in garrison at home. But since I'm talking about taking human life on the battlefield or in the battle space, the sort of nexus of this life cycle is major combat operations, right? That's where the transgressive act is likely to occur. And so then you can imagine before that, there's this period of moral recovery. But prior to that, there should be this period of moral readiness. And I just want to talk through how that might work a little bit. So I think when we're in the combat environment, I think there are some things we might be able to do to mitigate moral injury. When we're done with conflict, there are things we can do to respond to moral injury. But what I really want to focus on is moral injury prevention. What can we do up front right now to prevent, to mitigate the impacts of moral injury among airmen and guardians starting now, even though the great power conflict is sometime in the future. So that's the focus. And what follows here is really kind of a literature review. So I apologize for all the wordy slides, but I spent a lot of time, I locked myself in the Pentagon Library and tried to go through the history of what did we know when about moral injury. So this is reaching back all the way to World War I. Lord Moran was the equivalent of a flight doc. He was a doc attached to British ground units in World War I, and then he ended up becoming the physician to Winston Churchill later in life. And he wrote this memoir, and he says that we, the company officers and I, we did not bother about men's minds. We did what we could for their bodies, right? So he's sort of admitting that in World War I, the best that they could do in the trench warfare of World War I was try to heal physical wounds and get people to be able to fight the fight physically. He said, we just did not consider any of the mental, emotional, psychological stuff. By the time we get to World War II, that's developed to some degree. Here's Hap Arnold in a report to his boss, the Secretary of War, and he notes that relative to ground forces, so he's talking specifically about airmen. We're learning a lot about how airmen operate in World War II relative to their ground counterparts. And here he says the nervous strain imposed on airmen is much greater than any physical effort. So he's trying to distinguish these two groups by saying, actually, if all you're looking at is the physical strain on an airman, you're probably missing the most important part. Still in World War II, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but this is part of the official history of air power in World War II, Allied air power in World War II. This chapter is written by a doc who went out to survey sort of how the medical community within the Army Air Forces served their units. And he talks about how a lot of the psychologists, a lot of the flight docs did coalesce around some conclusions that they could agree about. But there was less agreement about some other stuff. And what he's talking about there is almost below the threshold mental emotional stressors. So there are some mental emotional stressors that are going to spike that cause them to have to take a person out of an airplane. But then there's these stressors below the threshold that kind of are simmering all the time. And he said there was much less agreement about that. He talks about apprehension, anxiety, frustration, tension, desire, fatigue. And they didn't really know what to do about those things. And the average physician preferred to spend their time on the things that they understood rather than taking all the intellectual effort to try to solve these mysteries that they didn't understand. And so he says ultimately in that third paragraph, the relationship between these everyday emotional reactions and grosser disturbances of behavior was not at all clear. So there's something happening at sort of the everyday, these folks are going out and fighting the fight every day, that's having an impact on them that they're not able to see until it becomes what he calls a grosser sort of response. So in World War II, they recognized that the psychology matters, but they weren't yet well equipped to deal with it. This one was fascinating to me. This is not about the airmen. This is about soldiers on the ground. But in this report from the Army, it says that one of the predictors for whether fighting men would do well emotionally, psychologically, was whether they had good leadership. Okay, that's fine. We all accept that. We would anticipate that, right? But he says even those that had good leadership, if they didn't have time, if they didn't have the opportunity to become acquainted with and learn the modern battle lore of the unit, then they would struggle. And that's fascinating to me, right? So one of the things, believe it or not, according to this report, one of the things that can bolster a fighting force during great power conflict is understanding the battle lore of the unit, giving them a unit identity, inviting them to participate in the unit identity. I thought that was fascinating. I think this is the last one I got here in this section, but this is again Hap Arnold writing to the Secretary of War. Again, fascinating. So they recognized that there were some issues where they didn't need to take the airmen out of the fight completely and send them home, but they did need to give the airmen a period to decompress. So they had these sort of restoration houses where they can send an airman for 4 days or 7 days or 2 weeks. And Hap says in this very brief report, he says that we did 3 things. Every time we got one of these guys in one of these houses, we did 3 things. First, they got a thorough medical examination. Okay, that makes sense. Third, they got an orientation on developments at home. But look at that second one. Second, he had to discuss his military experience with men who understand his problems because they also have faced them. This is fascinating to me. I know you all are probably way ahead of me on this as religious support professionals, but years ago, I wrote a book about the ethics of remote warfare, and I interviewed the human performance team at Creech. And when I talked to the chaplain there was a chaplain, operations psychologist, and a physiologist. I expected the chaplain to tell me that he sees himself as the first line of defense against moral injury. And that's not what he said. He said he can't be the first line of defense. He actually pointed to the cross on his uniform and he said, I'm a non-combatant by law. I've never squeezed a trigger and I'm never going to. The first line of defense has to be the senior NCO in the unit who's experienced that before, who can sort of put his arm around the younger airman who's experiencing it for the first time and make sure that he gets in the right headspace. And lo and behold, that was a lesson that we had to learn at Creech via the human performance team that Hap Arnold also learned by, I think, 1945. We're coming to a close here, I promise. I know there's plenty of comments. I look forward to getting into those. Okay, so we made it through World War II. We're now in the Vietnam era. Jonathan Shea, as you probably know, spent a lot of time working with veterans of the Vietnam War in the Veterans Administration system. He wrote a book about it in the 90s called Achilles in Vietnam. And he's the guy who coined moral injury in the first place. So the term has sort of grown since he initially defined it. But he says unequivocally that moral injury is an essential part of any combat trauma that leads to lifelong psychological injury. So we're finally in a place, at least to put a name to what these to what these folks are dealing with. So back to my initial chart, right? If it is in fact the case that we can identify certain causes of moral injury, the challenge for us then is what do we do to prevent those kinds of moral injury? And the gauntlet that I want to throw down here is I think one thing we might consider doing as we look forward to, we don't look forward to great power conflict, right? We look forward to our deterrence being successful. But as we prepare airmen and guardians for great power conflict, one thing we might do is lean more heavily on the World War II cases. And that's in part because World War II was just horrific. It was just horrific. So here's one way that we could think about that. This is Hap Arnold. So these are not actually his words. The librarians at the library actually found this memo for me. I had seen it cited several places, but they dug it up out of the archives. This is from Hap's chief of staff to Hap Arnold's subordinate commanders. So it is the message from Hap Arnold. It's technically written in someone else's words, but I think it's safe to say that this is his view. This is his orders that are going out via his chief of staff. Listen to what he says. He says, this is a brutal war. The way to stop the killing of civilians. The way to stop the killing of civilians is to cause so much damage and destruction and death that the civilians will demand their government cease fighting. Does it sound to you like Hap is saying we should kill civilians? The way to stop the killing of civilians is to cause so much damage and destruction and death, not that the soldiers sue for peace, but that the civilians will demand their government cease fighting. Man, it sounds like Hap Arnold of the United States Army Air Forces is saying the best way to end this war is to kill civilians. And then notice he catches himself, or his chief of staff does, and says this does not mean that we are making civilians or civilian institutions a war objective, but we can't pull our punches because some of them may get killed. This to me reads as deeply ambivalent, right? Ambivalent, meaning there's two valences here. It seems to me like he's saying the best way to win is to target civilians, but we can't target civilians. That's the story that we tell ourselves as airmen. That's not what we tell ourselves, right? You can go watch Masters of the Air, that HBO special that came out. last year. The story we tell ourselves is that it was the Brits who were targeting cities, and we were doing our best to target military objectives. Over the course of the war, by 1945, we really were pretty close to where the Brits were, creating cocktails of chemicals to burn down cities with bombs. So I'm not saying that to tarnish your view of the United States Air Force. I'm saying great power conflict is morally very, very hard. And again, I don't think we're preparing Airmen Guardians for that difficulty. Here's our counterpart, Bomber Harris. He was the commander of the British Bomber Command. He wrote this in a memoir years after the war. And again, it struck me, it's fascinating to me. Just listen to the tone. He says, whenever the fact that our aircraft occasionally killed women and children is cast in my teeth, I always produce this example of the blockade. And then he talks about how ugly blockades and sieges are because they starve the entire city. In fact, they starve the women and children first because the fighting men need to eat the food so that they can continue fighting. And so it's almost in this argument, it's implicit, it's not explicit, but he's almost saying, look, bombing cities is bad, sure, but morally it's not as bad as a siege, because at least when we bomb cities, the fighting men get killed right alongside the women and children instead of killing women and children first. Oh, as an ethicist, this is so hard for me to read, right? But again, I just want to impress upon you that great power competition, great power conflict rather, is morally very, very difficult. And I think we need to prepare folks for that. So I leave you with this. This looks like a very old picture, and it is. Frank Randall's a very old guy. He passed away many years ago. But essentially, this is us. I mean, these are our airmen, and this is potentially what we're faced with, the great power conflict. And it's my sort of deep. I almost want to say calling to try to do everything we can to prepare Airmen Guardians for the difficulties of great power conflict, so that we can be morally ready when the time comes. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to peruse the chat. I'd love to hear from you.
Hey, Lieutenant Colonel Chapa, this is Chaplain Zecker again. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I'm going to lead off with a question. Based on this discussion that you have just provided, what can we as the Chaplain Corps do in our respective roles as we are caring for the soul of the warfighter wherever we are? What can we do with this information, or what should we do in light of ethics and great power competition? To prepare, what would be your recommendation? Over.
Yeah, great question. I think that the first step to getting this right is providing commanders, and then through commanders, their units, with the vocabulary to talk about these issues. So, I think there's one view of sort of the ethics of war that I think it's the wrong one, but there's one view that says, look, you have to pick a side. Either war is wrong, war is bad, and so of course you're going to suffer moral injury because killing people is bad. Or you have to say, look, we're going to war, it's the right thing to do, and so stiff upper lip, suck it up, buttercup, stop feeling bad for yourself. We gotta go take the fight to the enemy. Neither of those two answers help airmen work through the challenges of having to take a human life. And so I think what we tend to lack is the vocabulary for having a conversation about why it matters morally that we're killing people, even when they're enemy combatants who have given up their right not to be killed. So I think chaplains are ideally suited to not lead that effort. I think that has to be a commander-led effort, but to provide resources to commanders for building that vocabulary and having that conversation. And it's not notional. This happens in real life. I mean, I had a friend who was a sitting Reaper Squadron commander, and they had a shot that went bad, and they killed a kid. And this brand new A1C, brand new airman, ended up in his squadron commander's office saying exactly what my grandfather said. I don't know how God could forgive me for this. And fortunately, in that moment, that commander had the resources, had spent time studying the just war tradition, was prepared to lead this airman through a conversation about how to reconcile that. But that's where I think the value from the Chaplain Corps is on this topic. Joel, go ahead. It's great to see you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Joe. Really appreciate this this discussion. That was awesome. I couldn't write notes fast enough. Yeah, so kind of on the tail end of that comment that you just made. I think to Chaplain Zecker's question, I think one of the pieces that I think is the next step for us in the Chaplain Corps in terms of caring for people in moral injury or the potential thereof is that just war tradition piece. I think we have We need to get more educated ourselves on that, because frankly, I didn't learn that stuff in seminary. I thought I would, but I didn't. But also sharing that, communicating that, so that there's a framework of language along these lines that people can use to process this. When we were at Creech, this was part of our, it was part of our kill chain brief, was to talk about just war tradition as kind of the basis for understanding how we engage in warfare. And if what you're suggesting in this, is that the great power competition and future combat conflict is going to look a lot, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're saying the potential is the future of warfare is going to look a lot more like World War II than it did post 9/11 conflicts. In other words, I mean, this isn't the right term, but the likelihood of more carpet bombing type actions versus precision guided munitions is in our future. If that's the case, then more than ever before, we need to understand just war tradition on what I would say is a tactical and individual level, as well as a strategic corporate level. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, 100%. I don't want to give anybody the impression that I think the next war is going to be exactly like World War II, by no means. But I think, what you've seen, I've got a paper somewhere where I talk about this. You can look at the circular error probable, which is a CEP of 50 says how big is the circle in which 50% of the bombs will fall. And so that circle was huge in World War II. And over time, it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So now laser guided weapons, I mean, it might as well be inches. But that's not the whole story, right? Because at the same time, we're seeing already through AI and other things, we're seeing the adversary's ability to obscure the battlefield, right? So even though the technology is getting better and better and better, the fog of war never goes away, right? Turns out Clausewitz is still right. And so I think the concern in the future is that we have incredibly precise weapons and incredibly imprecise data about where we want to shoot them, right? And so one example, I'm not casting aspersions. I have no insider knowledge here, but I'm sure you saw the coverage of the girls' school in Iran that used to be an IRGC facility, right? Man, that is the fog of war. And so, although I'm sure that whatever weapons we use to strike that thing were incredibly precise, we hit the wrong building, right? We shouldn't have hit that building in the first place. And again, I have no doubt that the folks who participated in that are going to have some moral injury concerns to work through. I think that's going to be the norm in great power conflict, where we're going to do the best we can with the information we have, and sometimes the wrong people are going to be killed, and airmen are going to have to learn how to live with that. So certainly, I do think that's a part of the analysis here. As for the chaplains and just war theory, I mean, I won't hide my views here. I absolutely think we, the United States Air Force, owe the chaplains a requirement to be educated on just war theory. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I don't know if that's a course at the Chaplain Sport College. I don't know if that's advanced, right? When you all have the opportunity to go get your advanced degrees beyond your initial seminary degrees, I don't know. That's your world, not mine. But I absolutely think we owe that as a requirement because I think there's going to be a demand from commanders. And I don't mind being candid with you. The feedback I got both from my boss, the Vice Chief of Staff, and your boss, sort of the Chief of Chaplains, is that it can't be only chaplains. It has to be commanders asking for this resource. And so we're working on that in our office to figure out where do we put the language in the sort of strategic guidance so that commanders know that this is something they're responsible for. Commanders need to know that they're responsible for being able to lead this conversation in their unit. Right now, that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and to that point, I think, and this is something that I've tried to communicate to commanders in the last few years of my career, and that is that sometimes they think about this, especially when the lawyers start using ethics language, like the joint ethics regulation, all that kind of stuff. They think they go to the lawyers for ethics, and I tell them, no, you don't go to lawyers for ethics. You go to lawyers for what's legal. You go to the chaplain for what's ethical. That's that joint. That's the just war tradition. Because my concern it isn't so much what's legal or illegal. I don't have that in my job jar. What I do have in my job jar is that you as a commander, you as a combatant, can lay your head on your pillow at night knowing that the shot that you took that day, the combat that you engaged in, was consistent with a moral theory, with a moral tradition that we follow as combatants. And so, to your point earlier, yeah, there may be some times where it's ethically and morally acceptable to accept some level of non-combatant casualties. But if you haven't worked that out, if you haven't worked that through, then you're going to have a lot more issues. So I would agree with you that we should be the ones kind of providing that guidance to commanders, but we also have to be educated ourselves so that we be trusted to give them the guidance that they need for that. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Great inputs. I appreciate it. And forgive my familiarity. I should have called you sir right from the beginning, but I was so pleased to see it.
No worries. No worries.
Major Knight, go ahead.
So I work at Buckley Space Force Base. We work with Guardians doing the missile warning mission, and so I have a question. I think with so many folks who have visibility or kind of access to see some of the things that are happening. We think a lot about moral injury for people who maybe have a perceived lack of agency. What I mean is they're not making something happen. So my folks, for instance, they don't do the killing, but they are responsible for warning people. And so what do you think about that as far as moral injury in that context?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things I claimed in my book, which came out in 2022, that I stand by, I think it's borne out, is that remote warfare was kind of a unique thing in the Predator and Reaper career field, but that's going to be the norm as we go forward, right? So what you're going to start to see the space folks, cyber folks, right? Even long range, JASM ER, people who can shoot weapons from 600 miles away. You're going to start to see people participating in combat operations on some level from a distance. And so I think it matters how we think about the distance and how emotionally and mentally engaged we are, even though we're distant. So that's thing one. Thing two is on agency. I think you're absolutely right. So I'm gonna share some vulnerability here. I'm not proud of the way I reacted to this, but years ago, like 2012 or something like that, an Air Force intelligence professional named Matthew Atkins published a piece in, I think it was like Lawfare or something like that. And in the piece, he argued that actually we, the intelligence analysts, are bearing the burden of post-traumatic stress and moral injury because we're the ones finding the targets. And in my gut, I felt like, how dare you try to take that from us, right? We're the ones actually releasing the weapons. So we must be the ones that bear this burden. How dare you try to claim that you're bearing the burden? And I'm so ashamed of that response because we're all contributing to the pointy end of that spear, right? And in fact, it might be the case that because they don't, in the intelligence community, they're picking the targets, but they're not releasing the weapons, right? And so, like you said, it might be the case that the lack of agency right at the pointy part of the spear actually makes their burden a little bit more difficult to bear than mine, because at least I am the one squeezing the trigger, making that decision. And I think, like you suggest, the further you get back in that causal chain, the less agency someone might feel. And so for your space operators, I absolutely think there's something to think about there, right? That they are part of the apparatus of war making. They're able to see the things, but potentially not be able to do anything about them. And I think that's I think that's a real cause for concern. I don't think it's insurmountable, but I do think that should go into questions about, how do we best serve those folks. I'll just give you one analogy that I've been thinking about for a long time. I was casual at Nellis before pilot training, and I got to sandbag 10 rides in the back of a F-15D model. And I every time I started to feel a little bit queasy, the pilot would let me fly the airplane, right? And there's this physiological theory out there that having control over the airplane actually makes the air sickness better, right? It makes you feel better because you're the one in control. When the bumps come, you are the one sort of causing them. And I do think there's an analogy to be had here that the less agency you can claim over the destructive things that we do, it might be the case that that's an even greater burden to bear. I think that's a great question.
Thanks.
Trying to get caught up on the chat as we go, but if anybody has anything, feel free to jump in.
Hey, Lieutenant Colonel Chaplain Zecker again here. Do you have any, so for those of us who are kind of interested in this topic and they want to explore further, do you have any other recommendations for those of us out there who want to continue learning and how to educate ourselves on this topic? Over.
Yeah, if you want an entry-level book, there's a Vietnam veteran called Carl Marlantes, and he wrote a fantastic book called What It Is Like to Go to War. He studied philosophy at Oxford at the master's level, so it's sort of a philosophically informed war memoir. But if you've never thought about this kind of stuff, about the ethics of war, I think that's a great place to start. If you want a much more sort of a more master's level read, a friend of mine, his name is Mark Levesque. I can spell that if you want me to. He has a book out with Oxford University Press called The Good Kill a couple of years ago. And it is a contribution to the moral injury literature from an ethics perspective. So he has a theology background, so he's coming at it from a religious perspective. But what one of the things he contributes in that book is there are some people, especially James Mattis, who kind of chafed at the idea of moral injury because he didn't want to think of his Marines as being injured mentally. And so Mark offers this term moral bruising to say you might have situations where the moral injury is so significant that you got to be taken out of the fight. You might also just have moral bruising, which is a moral injury that you can tough it out and work through. And I think thinking about that sort of spectrum is important. Yeah, Captain Murphy.
Yes, sir. Just a quick question for you. I'm currently in the an IRSRG community, and specifically with NSA, and I'm curious if there's anything that you've seen on the correlation of moral injury, and then also like propaganda. And specifically, what I have in mind is, I've airmen doing the mission, and with the latest conflict, we've seen a lot of these Lego-made videos, propaganda videos that have kind of gone viral on social media. And what I've noticed is that caused some apathy among my members because it kind of turned some of the work they were doing into a joke and also removed them even further from the conflict. So I'm curious if you have any resources or if there's any kind of look at the impact of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really insightful question. I have a slide that I didn't put in here, but that's a real problem, right? So take all of the horrors of World War II. One thing that was never at stake. I mean, it was never a live question for anyone I have ever read from World War II is whether we were the baddies or not. Everybody involved in that war from the American side knew that they were fighting a just cause. I think as soon as we go to war where everybody's got a sort of a TikTok machine 12 inches from their face, that paradigm changes completely, right? Where you're gonna go to war and you're gonna be barraged by adversary propaganda saying that you are on the unjust side. What you're doing is wrong. You're the aggressor. And man, I wish I could tell you how we're going to solve that. I have no idea. I think ultimately that's going to come down to commanders, right? Commanders, again, have to own that responsibility for explaining to their folks why this is right and good, what it is that we're doing. But I'm deeply concerned about that.
Hey, we're out of time, but I will give you the last word, Lieutenant Colonel Chapa. I just wanted to say thank you so much again for your willingness to come and educate the Chaplain Corps this afternoon. Again, I know you are very busy, and again, we appreciate you lending your time, your talent, and your expertise in helping train us. What I've learned from this is that the commanders shoulder a very heavy burden in preparing their warfighters for the realities of large-scale combat operations. And as a core competency of ours is to advise commanders. And so one thing that we should do as RSTs is to get smart and prepare ourselves as advisors in topics such as just war theory, so that when our commander is put in this position, or whatever commander we advise, they as well are equipped and prepared and ready to deal with these really difficult ethical challenges that they're going to face in the future, and they probably face right now. So I kind of take this, what I've learned from this is a kind of a challenge to go get smarter on just war theory, and to continue to talk to smart people like yourself. So thank you so much. I'm going to give it to you for the last word. Again, thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Chaplain Zucker, again for having me, and thank you all for coming. As a last word, all I'll say is thank you for what you do. I know that you are invested in taking care of our airmen and guardians, and I think that work is incredibly important. And as you can tell, I think it's going to become more important, not less. So thanks for doing what you do, and I'm happy to help however I can.